Good afternoon, everyone. This is the midweek message for St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church for June the 4th. Just want to start today by saying that I've been thinking a lot about perspective in the last little while. And one reason for this is that after spring where that frequently veered back into winter and a pandemic that has delayed pretty much everything. In the past 2 weeks, I've finally taken out our vans to get serviced and their winter tires off, in the beginning of June. Each time we've been given a car as a loaner, and it's been quite a change in perspective after driving a large, tall minivan for the better part of 5 years. This is especially true right now since the loaner car that I have sitting in my driveway right now is a 15-year-old BMW 3 Series with a lowered suspension. Not a car I ever thought I'd be driving. But life looks a whole lot and feels a whole lot different when I'm driving right now. But the main thing that has me thinking about perspective right now, of course, has to be the news coming out of the United States in this same period of time. As I've read and watched, as I've done so with a mix of many different thoughts and feelings. Foremost have been feelings of sadness, really profound sadness, as well as anger that yet another African American has been killed by police there during a dubious or just flat out unjust arrest. The name George Floyd sadly has joined a list that is far too long in this last decade alone. One that includes people like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Breonna Taylor, a woman who was killed in an incident just 2 months before Floyd's death a week ago Monday. But I've also been fighting feelings of resignation, knowing that there's not much I can do for the situation in the U.S., just by the simple fact that I'm a Canadian. And as my Facebook has lit up with posts by my admittedly mainly white friends expressing their outrage at the situation and their support for African Americans and other people of color, I've been torn between not wanting to be silent in the face of events that are deeply troubling for many of my friends and acquaintances here in Canada who are not white, yet wondering what I can add to the conversation as a white man living in a comfortable middle-class suburb who has spent most of my life in mainly white middle-class suburbs. I grew up in Burlington. I served in Georgetown, and now I live here and serve in Ancaster. One thing that I have been trying to do, as I've been trying to figure this out, one thing I've been trying to do has been, first and foremost, to listen to the voices of Black Canadians and other people of color, knowing that their perspective on life in Canada is quite different from mine, and dealing with the fact that this listening can be quite uncomfortable, even for someone like me who tends to lean towards the progressive side of the political spectrum, whatever that means. Yet doing this is necessary because there are plenty of things that I cannot see from where I'm sitting most of the time. And this is something I've been aware of for a long time, even if it wasn't always at the forefront of my mind. I grew up in Burlington in the late 80s through the 90s, and which was even more white then than it is today. It's a little bit more diverse now in 2020. And even as a kid, I was aware that it wasn't always the friendliest place for minorities. At that time, again, in the 90s, this was especially true if you were one of the growing number of people of South Asian descent moving into the community. This was made blatantly obvious. I mean, I heard how people talked, but particularly later in elementary school, I remember a police officer coming into our classroom to talk about racism because a lot of kids from my school were harassing convenience store operators and clerks in the neighborhood. They're also hassling, there were a fair number of Sikh families in the neighborhood, and you'd see them out walking, but they were getting harassed too. And to be honest, as much as I was bullied a lot at that school, the school had a major bullying problem. But I know that as bad as things were for me, it was worse for the socially awkward Indian kid in my class, because he got called things I sure didn't. Usually that four-letter word for someone of South Asian descent, regardless, it starts with a P and is applied to them regardless of what country you are from the region. Didn't help that his last name also started with P. People were pretty cruel. But despite being aware of this, I have to confess I was still taken aback later on in high school when one of my two best friends shared with me what it was like growing up Jewish in Burlington. I didn't really think, as much as I had again, one of my two best friends was Jewish, I didn't really think anti-Semitism was too much of a thing in Burlington. But he said to me one evening when we were just hanging out, he said, yeah, Burlington is not a friendly place for Jews. And that shocked me. And in that moment, I think that thing that, in my mind anyways, I didn't say it, thank God, but it went through my mind. It's like, really? Can it really be that bad here? Are you sure? And yet, of course, and I didn't say anything because Lord knows I don't know what he experienced, and I know deep down how people can be, and yet I still didn't want to necessarily think that about my community. And even as someone, I'm not one of those people that has a lot of hometown pride. I like where I live, but it was just where I lived, and yet even on that level, I didn't want to think that about my community, that Burlington was a place where there was anti-Semitism. And so the conversation, I'll confess, made me feel a bit uncomfortable. And this is what makes dealing with racism here in Canada so difficult. On the whole, it's a lot more subtle than it is in the United States. And as Canadians, we have a long history of contrasting ourselves with Americans. That probably goes back at least to the War of 1812. Sometimes I think we should add the phrase "not American" to our passports. But the reality is that racism is pervasive in this country. But it's also so easy to miss, downplay, or ignore if it isn't part of your lived experience. You can't help but see it if you listen to your neighbor who lives in that other perspective. And since that conversation with my friend in high school, I have been more aware of anti-Semitism. But again, it's easy to forget unless we are intentional in learning about that other perspective. And it often takes a shock to make us do this. After the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh back in 2018, I went off and dropped off some letters of support from our church to the 3 synagogues here in Hamilton. And as I did that, I was struck by the amount of security that every synagogue in this city has. A level of security that I've never seen in any church, not even in inner city churches. Simply because Jewish communities feel they need this. I remember talking with my friend, Simon, who's since moved to Toronto, and I asked him about that. And it's like, yeah, that's just part of being Jewish. That they have to have security for their synagogues, and it's necessary because it's just in the last year, his home synagogue here in Hamilton was vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti. Things that we again never think of as Christians, I think, in this country. Anti-Semitism is alive and well here in Canada, as is every other form of racism and discrimination, including anti-black racism. And one thing I think we can do about it, especially people that, again, I'm speaking to a congregation that is based here in Ancaster. I'm not sure where any of you watching this are watching from, but one thing that we can do about it is, I think, by being intentional and listening to the experiences of people of color, Indigenous people, as well as people of other religions, and take what they're saying seriously, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel, no matter how much there is that part of us that we probably don't even want to acknowledge, that says, can it really be that bad? Yes, it is, and because but it's hard to see because that's not our lived experience. That's just why we need to listen. Yes, the situation in Canada is distinct from that of the United States. Yet we do have our own problems here. And in times like this, events in the U.S. are deeply traumatizing to many Black Canadians, the same way that synagogue shooting was very traumatic for Jewish people living here in Canada as well. These things serve to remind them of what they have experienced, wherever it is on that spectrum of racism and discrimination, as well as their fears of what could happen to them, to their families, and to the members of their communities. And this is especially true when events south of the border correspond to events here, like the tragic death of a young Toronto woman named Regis Korchinski-Paquette during a police intervention a little while ago, that's currently being investigated by the Special Investigations Unit. And we pray that justice is done there for all involved. And certainly our prayers go out to Regis's family. It's a terrible loss. And I mean, part of this ongoing situation of not only race and policing, but also mental health and policing, and how we can do the best we can as a society for people who are in crisis. So in all these things, I really believe we're called to listen. And to not just listen, but really hear what our neighbors, friends, and acquaintances are saying to us. And let ourselves feel uncomfortable and wrestle with the realities that our community might be a little bit different than we think it is. And when we have listened, then we can ask, what can I do to help? What can we do to help? And again, let that conversation be led by the people who are affected by these things. And again, listening to those whose situation is different than ours is an important part of being a person of faith, being a Christian. And it's something, I mean, I've lived primarily in majority white areas my whole life. But one of the places where I have met people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds has been through church, both local congregational level, as well as I've served in ministry, and I've made some good friendships there. But to listen even more broadly, there's plenty of things in Scripture I could quote from. I'm just going to read a couple things from Proverbs 21, and incidentally, open is the best way to hold a Bible. Strange that needs to be said right now. But Proverbs 21 has a number of things that speak to us as people of faith. Proverbs 21 verse 3 says, "To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice." Righteousness and justice, these are things we're called to. And then there's a word of warning in verse 13 that says, "If you close your ear to the cry of the poor, you will cry out and not be heard." Again, our neighbors of other backgrounds may not be poor in terms of material things. They may be doing well in terms of, in one sense, in their situation. Yet the reality is, people of different ethnic backgrounds in our country do not all necessarily have the same advantages to those of us who are in the majority population. And there are different kinds of poverty. Certainly poverty and opportunity, poverty of justice. And in all these things, the clear witness of the Scriptures is that God hears these things. And I mean, we look at the beginning of the Beatitudes. Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor," or poor in spirit. "Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness and justice, for you will be filled." So hearing, listening to those voices who lack things that we have is important for us to do. and in this there is life. For verse 21 here in Proverbs chapter 21 says, whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life and honor. And as we think about ways that we can listen, even if we don't have a lot of people in our lives that we can turn to, if we don't have those kind of relationships, one simple thing we can do is learn some of our own history, especially when it's been experienced by people in this country who haven't formed the majority or been in positions of power. Hamilton has been home to a historic black community going back over 200 years, along with more recent additions of people from the Caribbean and Africa. And a great resource is this book here. It's called The Journey from Tollgate to Parkway. It was published in 2007 by the Hamilton Committee for Black History. And I picked it actually up at Fieldcoat Museum here in Ancaster, because Fieldcoat is also looks after Griffin House. Sorry, had a little moment there. Griffin House, where one of Ancaster's first African-American residents lived, started a very successful farm. Enrolls Griffin is actually buried in our cemetery, so I picked this up when I was making some inquiries about him a couple of years ago. And yeah, just learn the history from a different perspective, and see what it means to be black here in the Hamilton area, what it has meant, and how we got to where we are today. Or just, you know what, if there's somebody you know, and you build a relationship where you can ask that question, what is it like? What is it like for you? And let's listen. And as we listen, hopefully the Lord can lead us into ways that we can make this city, our community, a more just, fair, and welcoming place for people of all kinds. This will probably be the last midweek message for a while. As many of you know, my dad's been having some health challenges lately, which may or may not be directly related to his Parkinson's, but my parents have been needing more help lately, and as we go into the summer, I need some time to focus on helping to look after them. I'm going to be taking a week of study leave after this Sunday, both to learn some technology to make our services online a little bit stronger, and to also connect with people who don't have internet in our church. But there will be a message on Sunday, June 14th. But yeah, going forward, I'm going to need just a little bit more time to look after my parents, and I certainly would appreciate your prayers for my family in this time. So until we do this again, I pray that you would be well, and yeah, we'll be continuing out as long as it takes with our Sunday online worship. This week is communion by Zoom video conference. There'll be an email that'll go out tomorrow with the details for how to log into that, as well as people without internet will get a phone call to make sure that they have the information to log on. And there'll also be a video recording of our Zoom service, which will include Melanie Barlow from Ancaster Community Services as our guest speaker, to see how we can support our neighbors through that community organization. So long ending, but until I see you again, however I see you, take care. God bless. Be well.